The Pilgrim graphic novel has been a story that's been floating about in my head, I guess, for about the last 30 years. And it came about when I was doing research into some of the strategic psychological operations that went on during the Second World War. For those that saw The Imitation Game, Alan Turing had built this machine that was very efficiently, by the middle of the war years, breaking all the German codes and reading everybody's traffic from the German High Command. And they needed a way to hide that. They needed a way to deceive people into thinking that we weren't really reading their radio traffic, because then they would change the codes and they would change the way they operated. And that was literally the lifeline that kept Britain afloat during those dark years, 42, 43, 44, and was used as a deception operation when finally D-Day came around. So what they needed to do was convince the Germans that in fact we weren't reading their radio traffic. We were actually reading their minds. And the London Controlling Section, that was probably in the direct control of Winston Churchill himself, came up with these stratagems to convince the Germans that we were doing anything else but reading their radio traffic, and that was one of them. And the reason that some of the Nazi hierarchy bought it was because Himmler and a lot of the other members of Rudolf Hess were very immersed in the occult, and particularly Himmler. He was at Welsberg Castle. He had his own, basically his table of Knights of the Round Table, and he believed that he was going to be the man that would set this new mystical course for Germany after they won the war. And so they used that psychologically to plant these ideas into people's heads to hide the fact that we were reading their radio transmissions. So good was this, and the Germans had already been into a situation where they had an organization called the Adeneb, who was, as in Raiders of the Lost Ark, was sent around the world to collect magical sacred relics to protect both the leadership and the German armies on their rage of conquest across Europe. So they really went for it, hook, line and sinker. Obviously some of them didn't, and Admiral Canaris, who was one of them, basically an ally of the British throughout all of this, knew or suspected what was going on, but the leaders, the hierarchy, were fully taken in, and that's why Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland, believing he was going to be meeting the secret leaders of Britain, and he was going to be able to make a peace deal with the British and take the island of Britain off the checkerboard of war as a base for any landings on D-Day or anywhere else, any other territory that they thought they wanted to defend. And I know that sounds really strange and unbelievable now, but it comes from a Churchill quote, which is, "In war, the truth is so precious, she must always be accompanied by a bodyguard of lies." The story of the Pilgrim is about one of the entities that was rumoured to have been raised by a magical group. And many people were involved with the magical warfare and defence of Britain during the 40s. Some famous figures like Aleister Crowley, Dion Fortune, and a very interesting man called Kim Seymour, Colonel Kim Seymour, who had been an intelligence officer during the Boer War and during the First World War, and between the wars was certainly involved with helping some of the quieter monitoring of German magical groups. So when they needed somebody to pull some of this together, Seymour was involved with that. Seymour is one of the most mysterious and enigmatic characters I've ever come across in history, and I wanted to find it. The name was first given to me about maybe 95, 96, and I knew nothing about him at all. I started to dig into the history of who this man was, and he was a fascinating, mysterious character, even to the point that he's buried secretly in an unmarked grave in a West London cemetery. And so I made it kind of a personal mission to find that grave and just find out what the real story was. And so on one of my many trips to the UK, I actually worked out where the cemetery was in West London, went and visited, and a very nice Irish lady, I was inquiring about, did they have a grave on the name Kim Seymour, Colonel Kim Seymour. And she said, well, he's here, but are you family? And I said, no, I'm not actually. I'm writing a book about his life and some content for a graphic novel that we're working on. And she said, I don't really know much about him. He seems to have been a very mysterious person. And I said, he's probably one of the most unsung heroes of the Second World War. And he died in 1943 of a cerebral hemorrhage, apparently during one of the magical rituals where they were psychically embattled with the magicians from the Nazi hierarchy. And so important was he to the gathering of these various magicians and telepaths and whoever else they had working for this organization, that they buried him secretly, and he was put in a grave that in fact has a woman's name on it. And the only reason I know that was because when I was talking to this very nice Irish lady about, are you sure, could you show me, and she very kindly and sheepishly actually showed me the original burial documents for Kim Seymour in the grave, which she gave me directions to go and find it. And sure enough, the grave is owned by a lady. And the interesting thing about it was that she had written her address in London, at a hotel in Charing Cross, and then scrubbed that out, and then gave another address in Edinburgh, which she then scrubbed out. So there was no record that was easily accessible to even know who was buried in that grave. And I think that tells you something very important about what Kim Seymour's role really was in the gathering of the magicians to wage this, whether you believe it was a deception operation or whether you believe it had an effect, which a lot of people do. Who knows? But to me, I thought it was more people should know about this man called Colonel Kim Seymour. So he is featured in the Pilgrim comic book. So there's a couple of concepts that we put in here that at the time were pretty groundbreaking, and now of course are probably in the public domain quite openly. And one of those was the word Ebola, which of course now has been discussed, and people have tried to terrify people with what Ebola might be. And when I was serving in the military in the early 2000s, we did exercises where Ebola was brought into the mix as something that we would have to deal with if we were in Africa or anywhere else actually. With the concept of coming up with mechanisms to deal with the issues that might arise should the British Army or American Army or anybody else actually have an outbreak of Ebola within its ranks, not just the civilian population. And so we were talking about that, and so in this, the weapon of choice of the group, who is the protagonists in this graphic novel, their weapon of choice is an Ebola virus, which has been specially designed to be weaponized. And the lead character, one of the lead characters in it, is a female who is like a typhoid Mary. She is immune to the ravages of Ebola herself, but she can pass it on either through the air by breathing it into somebody's mouth, or various other ways she's got of passing on this deadly virus. And at the time we were talking about, was it possible for Ebola to be weaponized in any way? And I had already said then that if it was ever weaponized, then they already had a vaccine, because they don't weaponize something without you having an antidote for it. And so I was obviously pleased to find that when this latest outbreak of Ebola broke out with various people from not just the United Kingdom but from America as well, when there was an outbreak of that, surprisingly, a serum which was an antidote for this suddenly appeared on the world stage and appeared to be very, very effective. And so the fear of an outbreak of Ebola as a weapon suddenly subsided back into the darkness from which it should reside. And the other thing that we talk about within the comic book is the bell, which is a machine which is built and based on the concepts of the Glocker, which was a legendary flying machine that was built by the Nazis that could in fact defy gravity and fly like a UFO basically. And there's some again discussions about whether that science was used for other things, but in this we use it for the bell, which is the protective sphere which when the psychics go in to do their spying and their missions in time and space, the bell is charged so that they can't be followed. But we call sentient exomorphic anomalies, SEA. And a sentient exomorphic anomaly is basically what the Pilgrim is. It's a creature, it's some kind of consciousness which has been drawn, was called forth during the Second World War, and is now open to interacting again with one of the characters who is part of the team, and it's nicknamed the Pilgrim. And the reason it's called the Pilgrim is because one of the characters, Tom Dillon, was a member of a group called 14 Intelligence Company. And at Hereford, which is the home of the Special Air Service, there is a clock tower. And a man called J.E. Flecker, one of the bold and brave explorers of the early 20th century, just as Crowley was, just as T.E. Lawrence was, went all over the Middle East collecting data and measuring distances and finding hidden cities and all that kind of stuff. And Flecker's poem, part of the poem, The Golden Journey to Samarkand, is immortalised on the clock tower at Hereford. And it goes, "We are the pilgrims, master we shall go, always a little further it shall be, beyond that last blue mountain barred with snow, across that angry or that glimmering sea." And there's one other verse of that poem which is directly related to this story of the Pilgrim. It goes, "We travel not for trafficking alone, by hotter winds our fiery hearts are fanned, in search of knowing that which should not be known. We take the golden journey to Samarkand." So the science in the Pilgrim is based on some groundbreaking concepts about human consciousness. And I've always felt that, like Rupert Sheldrake, the universe is a living morphic thing with a consciousness, with a memory, and that we interact with it in a very subtle but very real way. And about 3 months ago, a man called Max Tegmark, Professor Max Tegmark at MIT, came up with something that I went, aha! I love it when scientists come out with something that you go, but this is magic, this is the occult. And whether you believe in magic or not, whether you believe that there's other entities out there beyond human perception, whether you believe that we can affect our own reality, when a scientist like Max Tegmark comes up with a theory which basically says consciousness, human and otherwise, is a byproduct of subatomic particles interacting. And the only way that we can perceive it, though, is the way of 3 dimensions of one linear time. That's how our brains are built. So we act like a filtering system for all of this interaction, for all of this information, but we can't store it. So we only see it the way that our brains are able to deal with it. Now we know there's dark matter, dark energy. We know there's oceans of water vapor floating in space. We know that there was water on Mars. There was water probably on some of the moons around Jupiter. We know a lot more about the universe, how big it is, how old it is, and that the chances that there is nothing else out there that's alive and conscious are extremely slim. There are other things out there, I believe, that are both interacting with our reality and for which we really have no way of perceiving what they are. And that is what the Pilgrim is. It's a creature from the darkest shadows, ancient primordial universe, which interacts with the hero of the story. I believe that there are entities, sentient exomorphic anomalies. I believe there are creatures out there that come from the most ancient, darkest corners of our universe that interact with us in a very different way. We don't understand sometimes how they communicate or how they work, and some of them are benign and some of them aren't quite so benign, but they don't understand human interaction either, so they just come in and come out. And in this particular case, the Pilgrim is an entity which is almost living as a parasite, and that is the name of the actual group that is, in this case, in this story, the group that is actually doing the work, the psychical research. The group is called Parasite, and they have these creatures, these anomalies that come in and out of their reality. But Tom Dillon, the hero of the story, has this energy this conscious entity attached to him, and it follows him around. So sometimes it manifests through him, and sometimes it manifests on its own. And they get into some pretty wild and interesting and strange, dark, twisted adventures together. And so that's part of the story of the Pilgrim.